This is the Unit 2 AP Microeconomics Review. So we're only covering two topics in this unit, marginal utility and externalities. They're standalone topics, the rest build throughout the semester, so we're going to do these first before we get into the market structure units. So marginal utility first. This is a term we've already learned. We learned it in the law of demand when we talked about diminishing marginal utility. And with the two other things we learned with law of demand, those pop up in this unit, so we're going to go over them really quick. All three things, the income effect, substitution effect, and diminishing marginal utility, describe why the demand line is downward sloping. They just describe an inverse relationship between price and the quantity that we consume. So not a shift, just describing why demand is downward sloping. So the income effect says that if prices of goods are higher, I can't afford to buy as much quantity, so my quantity demanded falls. The substitution effect says that if the price of a good increases, the quantity that I buy decreases because I'm switching to a comparable good. And then diminishing marginal utility, which is the one we're really going to focus on in this unit. This looks at decreasing satisfaction with each additional unit. So as you consume more and more and more of a good, you're less and less satisfied, which helps you determine how much of something you can consume. And how this fits into the law of demand is if I know I'm never going to be as happy with the fourth, the fifth, the sixth, and so on, the only way I'm willing to buy a large quantity is if the price is super low. Inverse relationship between price and the quantity I'm willing to buy. So let's look at the diminishing marginal utility more. We need to know this to determine how happy we are as we consume things. And we have two terms to describe this. Total utility, which is cumulative of all the marginal utilities added up. And then marginal utility is just the utility from consuming one additional unit. And if we look at total utility and marginal utility here, we can see total utility as I'm consuming more at first increases, but then as I'm less satisfied, it becomes to the point where it plateaus. And then eventually I should have stopped consuming because my total utility is falling. Same idea with marginal utility. My marginal utility decreases as I consume more. So as I consume more, it falls. And at the point where it intersects the zero, this is where total utility plateaus and starts to fall. My marginal utility actually becomes negative, showing that I am not satisfied at all by the consumption of more goods. So we use this and this formula here to determine how much of something we should consume. So we're going to be looking in most scenarios in two goods, comparing the marginal utility over price over one good and the marginal utility over price of another. And that can tell us how much of each good we can consume. Because we take both things into account when we're consuming, not just how satisfied the good makes us, but what we have to pay for it. So a simple example of this. Let's say that my marginal utility for the consumption of Oreos is 4, and the price of an Oreo is $1. And then the other good will say are Chips Ahoy cookies. So let's say my marginal utility for Chips Ahoy cookies is 6, and by 6 I mean 6 utils. Utils is the unit we use to measure satisfaction, so it's just how satisfied I am. And the price of a Chips Ahoy cookie is $2. So if I simplify that problem, my marginal utility over price of Oreos is 4, and my marginal utility over price of Chips Ahoy is 3. So with that price and utility combination, I'm not willing to consume as many Chips Ahoy cookies as I am Oreos, because my Oreo number is greater than my Chips Ahoy number. So what I'm going to do is keep consuming more Oreos. And then if I'm consuming more Oreos, diminishing marginal utility, this fraction is going to get smaller. And I'm going to keep consuming more Oreos until the point where the marginal utility of Oreos over price equals my marginal utility over price of Chips Ahoy. So by consuming more Oreos and less Chips Ahoy, it brings it back into that balance that we're looking for. But we need to do one additional thing. Not just marginal utility over price for both goods equaling another. We're also limited by our budget. We have a budget constraint to where we can only buy a combination of goods that we can afford. We can't buy our max utility of everything because we don't have money for everything. So we have to look at our income as well to determine what combinations of goods we're going to consume. And to illustrate this, I'm going to do the 2016 AP FRQ question for microeconomics over utility. So in this problem, it gave you several things you have to take note of. In the prompt, it said you only have $20, so that's your income you're limited to, and it gives you the price of the goods. You can't solve this problem without all three of those things. Good X is $4 a unit, and good Y is $2 a unit. But before I do marginal utility over price for these combinations, I notice it doesn't say marginal utility, it says total benefit. So what College Board did is it actually gave me my total utility first. So before I can even plug anything into the formula, what I have to do is turn it into marginal utility, which again is just the difference as I consume one more. The difference between consuming 2 units of X and 1 is 12, so that's my marginal utility of consuming 2 units of X. So what I did here is I took my marginal utility for consuming all of good X and all of good Y, and then I put that over price. So I have to do several steps to get the combination I'm looking for. Not just marginal utility, but marginal utility over price, which I have here, the price of 4 for X and 2 for Y, which then gave me my number I'm looking for the 2 to equal. And you notice I have several combinations where the two numbers equal each other. But what tells me which one specifically I'm looking for is my fixed budget of $20. Because here I could consume 1 of X and 2 of Y, and my marginal utility over price would equal each other. However, I'm not spending all of my income. And I'm going to try and get to that point where I'm spending all of my income and the two numbers equal each other. Which, if I go through it, I can see that they equal each other at 3 units of X and 4 units of Y. And if I'm buying 3 units of X at $4 a piece and 4 units of Y at $2 a piece, I am spending my full income of $20, which is why the answer is 3 units of X and 4 units of Y. So I'm not only doing marginal utility over price for every scenario, I then look at where the two align, where the marginal utility over price equal each other, and then I set it to my income. And that tells me the amount I should consume of X and Y. It's a lot of steps, but it always follows that pattern. Make sure it's marginal utility, set it over price, find where they equal each other, and equal your budget constraint. That's all we're going to cover with marginal utility. It goes more in depth into things like indifference curves, which just show that between good A and good B, I am indifferent to the two as long as it's between price and marginal utility. But we don't go in depth in that in this class, so other than the definition, you don't need it until later on in college. So we're going to move on to externalities. So we've always done a basic graph where the supply and demand intersect. This is the market equilibrium. And at this point, we've assumed that not only is the best for the producer and the consumer, but society as well. What we've been doing this whole time is that in a normal market equilibrium, the society's cost and the private firm's cost are one single supply line. But what if there's a problem that affects society as a whole, that separates the private cost line of the firm from the societal line? This is a negative externality. It's a negative, unforeseen side effect that ends up hurting society as a whole. It's not the producer's goal. They aren't trying to hurt society. They're just trying to be at their own equilibrium, their market equilibrium. But because of the externality of, let's say, pollution or chemical waste, it actually ends up hurting society and creating two supply lines. Now, it doesn't shift the supply to the left. It actually creates two separate supply lines like we see here, where the societal line actually moves to the left to show that society would be operating best at this equilibrium. And at this equilibrium quantity right here, which is the optimum, the society, the efficient point, the best point for society as a whole. But the firm, they're operating at their market equilibrium, where their costs are minimized. And so they're producing right here at the market equilibrium. And what we notice is between the market equilibrium and the optimum is there is a difference that makes a big impact on the society. Because if the producer is over allocating their resources, producing more than is best for society, they're going to emit spillover costs that hurt society as a whole. I have the over allocation right here. It's the quantity above where we are producing compared to where we should be producing at the optimum. And the spillover costs here are what creates the new equilibrium for society that says it's better to produce at the societal optimal point. But the firm has no incentive to do this naturally. So if they're left alone, they're going to be at this over-allocated point, and we're going to have deadweight loss. We see the deadweight loss right here. It's the difference between where we are and where we need to be at the society's optimal point. We notice as we move closer to the society's optimal point, the deadweight loss shrinks. So if we are at the social cost line, we're back to a normal equilibrium and there is no deadweight loss. But the producer has no incentive to produce at this point. So this is one of the few times in a free market economy we see the government as necessary to get rid of the overallocation and the deadweight loss. Most of the time in negative externalities, they will regulate it by taxing the producer. And we see the tax right here. What this does is it shifts the firm's private line to the socially optimal line, moving us back to that one normal equilibrium with just one supply line and not two separate ones. So this is a time where it's seen as necessary for the government to intervene to move us back to one normal equilibrium for both the firm and society. There also are positive externalities. Positive externalities, just like before, we assume that the demand line is one line and that line represents society's benefit and our own private benefit. But what if what we're doing has a positive unforeseen side effect on society as a whole? Like what if we get flu vaccines? So if I get a flu vaccine, I do it for me so I don't get the flu. However, if that ends up helping a bunch of other people not get the flu as well, that is a positive externality. So what ends up happening, similarly to the negative externality on supply, is positive externality creates a new demand line to the right of the private line, my own individual demand line. This line again represents society as a whole. So by getting the flu shot, it helps society as a whole. So the idea is, because if we were all getting flu shots, our entire demand for flu shots would be here, and we would be at a new equilibrium with the societal optimum, all the lines intersecting. But if we're not, we have this positive externality. And at a positive externality, we have an under-allocation of our resources, because this is where we want to be, at the socially optimal point. However, this is where we are, below it. So we are not putting enough of our resources towards the society's line. And again, because we're not at the societal optimum, we have deadweight loss. So again, if I go up and I look at the difference between where I am and where I want to be in a socially optimal quantity, I see the difference between the two is the deadweight loss. And it gets lower as well as I move closer to society's optimum. And before we had spillover costs that affected society from the producer, now we have spillover benefits. The positive externality ends up giving benefits to people beyond the individual consumer getting the flu shot. And there are negative externalities in demand, positive externalities supply, but on this AP exam, they only want you to do negative externalities supply and positive externalities demand. And just like with the negative externality on supply, this is seen as a place where the government should intervene to bring us back to the optimal quantity. And they should do this by subsidizing to bring us back to that point, to increase the demand back to that point where all of the lines intersect. And now we're just, again, at a normal equilibrium graph because society and the market are at the same place again. And that's going to be the goal. One distinction with taxes. If there is a lump sum tax doesn't affect a producer's behavior. Because if it's a lump sum, they don't have any incentive to change the quantity that they're producing to get it back to the society's optimal point. Some taxes don't affect behavior. We want a per unit tax on the externality because this would actually change the quantity that the producer would make and decrease the supply back to the societal's optimal point. And that's the Unit 3 AP Microeconomics video.